Margaret Whitmore had once danced at the finest ballrooms in the city. She remembered the weight of silk gowns and the gentle pressure of gloved hands guiding her across polished floors. Those memories felt like photographs from another lifetime now. 15 years had passed since the accident that changed everything. 15 years since her world had shrunk to the boundaries of her grand estate and the wheels of her chair. From her bedroom window she could see the gardens that had once been her pride. Now they grew wild and untended. The roses climbed without direction and the pathways disappeared beneath creeping ivy. Her housekeeper Mrs. Chen had tried to find suitable gardeners but none had lasted long. The estate was vast and the work demanding. Most were intimidated by the grandeur of the property or perhaps by Margaret herself. She had grown distant over the years. Her voice had become sharp when it used to be warm. Her smile had faded to polite acknowledgement. The weight of loss and the passage of time had settled around her like winter. On a particularly gray morning in October Mrs. Chen knocked softly on her door. "Mrs. Whitmore, there's someone here about the gardening position." Margaret sighed. Another hopeful candidate who would disappoint her with grand promises they couldn't keep. "Send them to the library, I suppose." The man who entered was not what she expected. He was perhaps 40 with gentle eyes and hands that bore the honest calluses of real work. His clothes were clean but worn and he carried himself with quiet dignity. "I'm Thomas Mitchell, ma'am," he said simply. "Mrs. Chen mentioned you might need help with your gardens." Margaret studied him from her wheelchair. There was something different about this one. He didn't avert his eyes from her chair the way others did. He didn't speak too loudly as if her legs had affected her hearing. He simply waited patiently for her response. "The gardens are extensive, Mr. Mitchell," she said in her practiced formal tone. "They've been neglected for some time. The work would be considerable and I have very specific standards." Thomas nodded slowly. "I understand, ma'am. I've worked with neglected gardens before. Sometimes they just need someone who's willing to listen to what they're trying to become." Something in his voice made Margaret pause. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her about potential rather than problems. The previous gardeners found the work too challenging. "Every garden has its own personality," Thomas replied. "Some need a firm hand, others need patience. From what I can see from here, your garden just needs someone who won't give up on it." Margaret felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. When had someone last spoken about not giving up? She found herself agreeing to give him a trial period. The next morning she watched from her window as Thomas began his work. He moved differently than the others had. Instead of rushing to make immediate dramatic changes, he spent time simply walking the overgrown paths. She saw him stop frequently to examine plants that others might have dismissed as weeds. He was gentle with things that were broken and patient with growth that had gone astray. By the third day Margaret found herself wheeling to different windows throughout the house just to observe his progress. He worked steadily but never seemed hurried. When he found struggling plants beneath the overgrowth, he would carefully relocate them to spots where they might thrive. She noticed he talked quietly to himself as he worked. Or perhaps he was talking to the plants. The thought made her smile for the first time in weeks. On Friday afternoon she surprised herself by wheeling out to the terrace. Thomas was working on the bed of roses that had once been her favorite spot. They were tangled and wild, but he was carefully separating the canes and checking for signs of disease. "Those were prize winners once," she called out. He looked up and touched his cap respectfully. "They still could be, ma'am. The roots are strong. Sometimes the most beautiful blooms come after a plant has weathered difficult seasons." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. "I used to spend hours out here," she found herself saying. "Before." She gestured vaguely at her chair. Thomas nodded and continued his careful work with the roses. "Gardens have a way of waiting for us," he said quietly. "They know when we're ready to return to them." That evening Margaret found herself thinking about his words. She had assumed her gardening days were over when she lost the use of her legs. But perhaps she had been too quick to surrender something she had loved. The following week brought the first real test. A severe storm rolled through, leaving branches down and flower beds flooded. Margaret watched anxiously from her window as Thomas arrived that morning. She expected him to survey the damage and perhaps make excuses about the added difficulty. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and began the patient work of cleanup. By afternoon he had cleared the main pathways and was already assessing which plants could be saved. That evening he knocked on the kitchen door. Mrs. Chen brought his message to Margaret. He wondered if she might like to see the progress despite the storm damage. Something made her agree. She hadn't been in the garden proper for 3 years. Thomas had laid wooden planks over the softer ground, creating a smooth path for her wheelchair. As they moved through the space, she began to see what he had accomplished. The wild growth was giving way to intentional design. The pathways were emerging clear and wide enough for her chair to navigate easily. "I thought you might want to be able to reach all the areas you once enjoyed," he explained. "The paths can be widened more if needed." Margaret's throat tightened. No one had thought to make the garden accessible to her. They had all assumed she would remain an observer. "There's something else," Thomas said. He led her to what had once been a cutting garden. Now it was cleared and ready for planting. "I thought perhaps you might advise me on what should go here. I know plants, but I don't know your preferences." The invitation hung in the air between them. Margaret realized he wasn't offering charity. He was asking for her expertise. "Dahlias," she heard herself say. "And cosmos for late summer color. Sweet peas along that fence for fragrance." Thomas nodded seriously as if he were taking notes from a master gardener. Which of course he was. Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself spending more time outside. Thomas would appear each morning and they would discuss the day's priorities. She began to remember the Latin names of plants and the proper timing for various garden tasks. Her voice grew stronger as she directed the placement of new plantings. Her hands itched to feel soil again. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, she deadheading spent blooms while he mulched around newly planted shrubs, Thomas made an observation. "The garden is healing," he said. "Plants respond when they sense they're truly cared for again." Margaret looked around at the transformed space. He was right, but she suspected he wasn't only talking about the plants. That evening she called her doctor. The next week brought a small miracle. Or perhaps it was simply the result of months of gentle encouragement and renewed purpose. Margaret had been working at the raised bed Thomas had built specifically for her wheelchair access when she felt the strangest sensation. A tingling in her legs that had been absent for 15 years. "Thomas," she called. Her voice held a note of wonder and fear. He was beside her immediately. "What is it, ma'am?" "I think," she hesitated, afraid to voice the hope. "I think I felt something." Thomas went very still. "Your legs." She nodded. They sat quietly for a moment, letting the possibility settle between them. "The doctors said," she began. "Doctors know medicine," Thomas said gently. "But gardens teach us about things that can't always be explained. Sometimes healing comes in ways we don't expect." Over the following days the sensations grew stronger. Margaret worked with fierce determination in the garden. Her hands grew dirty and her clothes became practical rather than formal. She began to remember who she had been before the accident. A woman who had loved the earth and growing things. A woman who had found joy in nurturing beauty. The breakthrough came on a morning when the autumn light was particularly golden. Margaret was working with a stubborn weed when she felt her left foot move. Not just sensation but actual movement. She gasped and Thomas looked up from where he was planting bulbs for spring. "It moved," she whispered. "My foot actually moved." Thomas set down his trowel and came to kneel beside her wheelchair. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her foot. She nodded. His gentle pressure confirmed what she had felt. There was response where for 15 years there had been none. Tears flowed down Margaret's cheeks. Not tears of sadness but of wonder and possibility. The months that followed were filled with small miracles. Physical therapy sessions that actually showed progress. Tentative steps with Thomas's steady arm for support. The garden became not just a place of beauty but a place of healing. By the time spring arrived, Margaret was walking short distances with a cane. The doctors called it unprecedented. They spoke of rare cases where traumatic spinal injuries could sometimes partially reverse given the right combination of circumstances. Margaret knew it was more than medical terminology. It was the result of finding purpose again. Of having someone believe in possibilities rather than limitations. Of remembering that growth sometimes requires patience but should never be abandoned. On the first anniversary of Thomas's arrival, Margaret stood in her garden without assistance. The space around her bloomed with careful design and wild abundance. The roses she had once thought were lost forever now climbed trellises Thomas had built. The cutting garden overflowed with dahlias and cosmos just as she had envisioned. Sweet peas scented the evening air. Mrs. Chen had prepared a special dinner to mark the occasion. As they sat on the terrace watching the sun set over the transformed landscape, Margaret reflected on how much had changed. A year ago she had been a woman defined by what she had lost. Now she was someone discovering what remained possible. "I have something to tell you," Thomas said as they watched the stars emerge. Margaret turned to him expectantly. "My name isn't really Thomas Mitchell." She felt a flutter of concern. "It's Thomas Mitchell Chen. Mrs. Chen is my mother." Margaret stared at him in shock. Mrs. Chen had never mentioned having a son. "She knew you needed more than just a gardener," he continued. "You needed someone who wouldn't see your chair first. Someone who could see what you were capable of becoming again. She asked me to come." She said her dear friend Margaret had forgotten how to hope. Margaret felt the pieces fall into place. Mrs. Chen's mysterious ability to find the perfect gardener. Thomas's intuitive understanding of what she needed. The way he had known exactly how to challenge her without pushing too hard. "She was right," Margaret said softly. "I had forgotten. But you helped me remember." They sat in comfortable silence as the garden settled into evening. Somewhere in the darkness night blooming jasmine released its fragrance. The fountain bubbled peacefully. The whole world seemed to breathe with quiet contentment. Margaret realized that healing had come not just to her body but to her spirit. The accident had taken away her ability to walk. But it had also given her the gift of understanding how precious mobility was. It had shown her the difference between being served and being truly cared for. Most importantly, it had taught her that sometimes the most profound changes come slowly. Like a garden that recovers from neglect. Like trust that rebuilds after disappointment. Like hope that returns after long absence. As Thomas helped her back to the house, she moved carefully but confidently. Each step was deliberate and grateful. Behind them the garden held all the promise of tomorrow. Plants that would grow stronger. Blooms that would return each season. Beauty that would continue to unfold. Margaret Whitmore had learned to dance again. Not in ballrooms with silk gowns but in her garden with dirt under her fingernails. This was a different kind of dance. Slower perhaps but no less beautiful. A dance with earth and season. With patience and possibility. With the quiet miracle of things that grow.